Good morning. So I chose to write my paper on Melville's Bartleby the Scrivener, specifically trying to focus on the course theme of labor and the workplace. So Herman Melville is an incredible author. He's most famous for Moby Dick, but he also wrote a lot of lesser-known short stories that are really fantastic as well. Bartleby the Scrivener, I would say, is certainly one of the strangest stories that I've ever read. Simply because so little happens, but it's such a impactful story nonetheless. So really, the events of the story are that it takes place in the 19th century. So it's before you have machines and you have copying machines and things like that. So the way documents are copied are you have these people, it's occupation, they're scriveners, and essentially they're a human copying machine. So their job is to take a document and then copy it. So the story revolves around this elderly narrator who is telling the story of this scrivener that made this impact on him and his life, and he feels the need to tell this story. So he's telling a story about back when he had this law office. It's not clear whether he's still practicing or not. And he hires these various kind of eccentric people to be his scriveners. But the latest is this guy, Bartleby. So when he first hires him, he's very productive. He's not having any problems. But soon he wants him to verify the copy. It's like a very normal thing that scriveners have to do. The idea is that they read their copy out loud while another person has the original copy, and that way they can make sure that it matches up word to word. So when he asks Bartleby to do this, very calmly he just says, "I would prefer not to." And that's a really absurd thing for an employee to say to their employer. And he almost thinks he misheard him, so he goes and he walks out there and he says, "Excuse me?" And he says, "I prefer not to." And, you know, it's an odd situation because normally, you know, he doesn't say it in a disrespectful or a rebellious way. He just says it so tranquilly. The narrator almost describes it as like inhuman. And he's so taken aback by the way in which he has said this, "I would prefer not to," that rather than fire him, he actually starts to almost doubt himself, and he kind of wonders what's going on with this guy. But he puts it off for later. He said, "I'll figure it out later." And eventually, Bartleby, you know what I mean, he starts doing less and less. They can't get him to do any tasks at all. And then eventually he stops copying as well. A bunch of different things happen. The narrator discovers he's been living entirely inside the office. And the whole gloom of the guy is just so much for him that he decides that, you know, he needs to get rid of him. But he can't fire him. He tries to fire him. He says, "Look, Bartleby, you know, here's X amount of money. You know, you have like 7 days to vacate." And Bartleby won't leave. Every time he comes back, he won't leave. And for whatever reason, the narrator doesn't call the police on him. He doesn't, you know, kick him out. Because he thinks there's something weird or something wrong about this guy. So he doesn't have the heart to just kick him out like that. But eventually he's like, this is becoming too much. And his solution is he's like, you know what, if Bartleby is not going to vacate, he says, "I'm going to move my entire offices." So he sets up his offices in a different area. Unfortunately, the new tenant of the old space can't get Bartleby to leave either. So he contacts the lawyer and he says, "Look, you left this guy at your old office space. You can't get him to leave." And the lawyer says, "You know, I don't know this guy. He has no relation to me. I'm not involved with him. He's no longer my employee. Essentially, it's not my problem." But you know, he goes over and he tries to make an attempt one last time. He says, "Look, Bartleby, do you want a job doing this? Do you want a job doing that? Let me help you." You know, he even says, you know, "Come with me home to my house. Come live with me." And Bartleby says, "No, I prefer not to." It's really all he ever says. And, you know, the new tenant is not as I don't know, merciful as the lawyer. He calls the police on him, and Bartleby gets evicted. He gets sent to prison. They call the lawyer one more time to fill out the report because apparently nobody knows this guy. The lawyer is honestly the person who knows him best. So he goes down to the police station. He fills out the report, and you know, he goes to see Bartleby. And he runs into, I guess, they call him like the prison grub man. He's the cook, and he says, look, you don't want your friend to starve out there, right? And he says, no, I don't. So he pays him some extra money so that the prison cook will give him some food. But, you know, I would assume whenever they asked him or something, he must have said, I prefer not to, because the lawyer comes back several days later. He goes out of the courtyard, and he finds Bartleby dead in the yard. And believe it or not, that's the story. That's the whole thing. It's a really odd story. It was strange. I couldn't quite figure out what was going on at the beginning. My initial reaction was, what's wrong with the lawyer? Why did he take so long to, why didn't he fire this guy? You know, who was this employee who just refused to be useful or to do, you know, any kind of work at all. And it seemed like a sad story. I felt bad for Bartleby, but aside from that, I couldn't really figure out what was going on or what Melville's point in telling this whole story was. And then I was really shocked when I started doing some research and looking into different literary criticism to discover that a lot of critics not only didn't view Bartleby as this sort of pitiable, sad man who, you know, lost his will to work, to communicate, and ultimately to live, but they actually viewed him as this, like, Christ-like figure, this person in line with Jesus Christ himself, or Gandhi, right? I saw comparisons made to Gandhi with his, you know, passive resistance, his refusal to eat while he was imprisoned, and various other interesting comparisons. So really, I wanted to focus my paper on that aspect of the story, and the idea that Bartleby is maybe this, you know, martyr who died for something greater, or at the very least fighting against something, and that's something I would propose is this, you know, soulless, soul-crushing workforce. My thesis was essentially that Bartleby the Scrivener presents the plight of the worker as an objectified, dehumanized cog in the wheel of the economic system, and Bartleby the character escapes this plight by transcending the system itself and changing the rules of the game. So the first thing that I'll just knock out of the way is the counter-argument. There have been a lot of psychological and more realistic interpretations of the story that propose that Bartleby, in fact, could have suffered from major depression. This is something that people see was evidenced by his continual lack of interest in activities. So he was interested at first, at the very least, in copying, and then throughout the story you see him do less and less, and eventually die. Some people conclude from that he was someone who suffered from clinical depression. Others point to the fact that he had little to no communication with anyone in the office or with anyone in the story, and they say that that could be evidence of an autistic disorder or something along those lines. I think it's much more interesting to consider the larger message that Melville may have been attempting to send in this story, and I think that's really captured by some of the literary criticisms I was able to find just using the LMC database. The first one that I thought was really interesting was a Freudian analysis of Bartleby the Scrivener. So if you're not familiar with, like, Freudian terms and Freudian concepts, the basic idea is this. You have your id, which is like the more natural animal, I guess, animal instinct part of the person, right? That's like, you know, food and sleep and sort of very basic things, right? That you just sort of want, right, as an animal. And then you have your ego, which is the more regulatory part of the self. It's the part of the self that allows you to participate functionally within society. So it's the more regulatory, controlling, the part of the self that that tells you what is appropriate behavior at a given time and what is inappropriate behavior at a given time. And what the author of that particular criticism, the point they were making, the article I believe was titled "Ah Humanity, Compulsion, Neuroses in Melville's Bartleby the Scrivener," that was that particular analysis was written by Dennis R. Perry. And he argues that each of the characters represent a different point along the id-ego spectrum, right? It's really interesting. So you have the lawyer, who is introduced as a very safe, orderly, conventional man, somebody who always takes the safe route, that sort of thing. And he represents very much the ego, and the idea in this analysis is that Bartleby actually represents the id, or the more, let's see, the farthest left end of the spectrum, and the idea is that he is challenging the lawyer, because the lawyer has this like very suppressing ego that I guess he has developed, you know, over the course of his life. And he makes a lot of interesting points. He says just like the setup of the office, the way he divides his office from the other scriveners, is evidence of the fact that he is trying to sort of put up these walls, these defenses against sort of the eccentric and the irrational, which is literally the idea of what the ego is meant to do, sort of metaphysically or metaphorically in the brain. He makes the argument that the lawyer does this quite literally with his dividers, the screen in the case of Bartleby, and then like I believe it's some sort of wall between him and the other scriveners. And basically the premise is that and the reason why this one in particular was so important was that it introduced the idea of the workplace as the true antagonist of the story. So the first time you read the story, you can think to yourself like, oh, well, it's the story from the narrator's perspective, and the real antagonist is Bartleby because he won't do anything. He won't do his job, and he's giving the narrator all of this you know, trouble as the narrator tries to come up with different strategies and different ways to cope with Bartleby. But the idea in this analysis is that the true antagonist of the story is the law offices, really Wall Street and the economic system itself. And the characters develop various, he refers to them as compulsion neuroses, or various defense coping mechanisms to deal with the reality of their work, which is this really menial, tedious task of, again, copying law documents. And the lawyer is not a particularly interesting lawyer either. He doesn't handle interesting cases or anything like that. Like I said, he's a very safe, orderly man, and the work that they do is very, very tedious and very menial. So I thought that was a really interesting analysis. It does present Bartleby more as a victim than as kind of a conscious actor, as the other two analyses that I like to reference do. So this one actually says that his ego sort of deteriorated over time and that he was no longer able to regulate his id. And I prefer to take a somewhat different interpretation of it. Another, you know, criticism that I found that sort of highlights this is called Bartleby the Socratic. And it compares Bartleby, both the story and the character, to Socrates himself, which I thought was a really interesting analysis. And takes note of the way that Bartleby always says, you know, I would prefer not to. He doesn't say a whole lot, but in a sense he's teaching the lawyer this very important lesson, which is very much, it's not unlike the Socratic method. Socrates was someone who would often ask a lot of questions of the people he was talking to, and in that way he would lead them to conclusions themselves without explicitly saying anything. also like Socrates, because of his unconventional way of doing things and his value system that differed from the value system of his overall society, both Bartleby and Socrates were, in a sense, persecuted and died for their beliefs. They died rather than, be isolated, which is something that he touches on in that analysis as well. The most interesting part of that analysis is definitely the end, where they talk about the dead letters office, or the epilogue that the narrator presents as a possible explanation for Bartleby's strange and antisocial behavior. And really it's a weak excuse. He says that Bartleby used to work at this dead letters office. His job was to dispense of these letters that never reached their intended recipient, or were sent to Santa Claus or God or somewhere where they couldn't be delivered. And they say that maybe the act of him having to destroy all of these letters really is what brought him, to his to the state that we see him in the story. Ultimately, I believe this is a really, and the analysis touches on this, really a poor explanation for the enigma that is Bartleby. And I think it represents, he says that what it does is, he says the rumor is yet another of the attorney's reductive rationalizations, as when he convinces himself that Bartleby's obdurate refusal to work stems from eye strain. The rumor amounts to a parody of tidy plot resolutions and in no way elucidates Bartleby's role in the man's life. So, essentially, you see the lawyer throughout the entire story trying to rationalize what is essentially irrational behavior. He's trying to understand, well, surely if I do this, Bartleby will react in this way. And you see throughout the entire story, he is consistently wrong about every single prediction he makes surrounding Bartleby. And what, I believe his name is Furlani, what Andre Furlani in Bartleby the Socratic, the argument that he makes is, if you believe the lawyer this final time when he gives you this explanation in the epilogue, in a sense, you have failed. Not only has the lawyer failed, but you have failed the test of the story. So the test expands beyond the story to the reader with the final epilogue. And the idea is, if you believe the lawyer's rationalization, choose to think as he does, you have essentially failed that test as well. Because what the lawyer is doing, and the final source that I have touches on this as well, is the lawyer is failing to realize his complicity in Bartleby's inevitable demise, and in the role that he plays as Bartleby's employer, and the role that the workplace generally plays in Bartleby's failure to express himself, and his, ultimately his failure and his deterioration of his ego to control his id, and for him to continue to act appropriately. But in a sense, Bartleby being this pure id, this they say he follows this new logic of preference, right? Which is a strange thing. He always says, I would prefer not to. And really, Scriveners don't have much preference at all in what they want to do, right? So it's sort of this odd thing, this odd sort of logical thing that he plays on the lawyer. The idea is that in doing this, he's actually teaching a lesson to the lawyer, and he even sacrifices his life, for the lawyer to understand this. And unfortunately, there is evidence that while the lawyer has grown throughout the story, he certainly seems less sure of himself than he did at the beginning. He has not fully learned this lesson. He has not fully internalized it. And because of that, it is up to the reader, it is up to you to really pull out the message that Melville is trying to, put into this story, and for them to understand it, the readers of this story when he first published it in, I believe, a magazine. The final source that I have that I thought was really interesting talks about Bartleby and the failure of conventional virtue, and it really analyzes the lawyer's role in the story as a Christian and as someone who sees himself as a moral individual, because that plays a really big role in the reason why he doesn't fire Bartleby outright, because he believes, I believe he says, that both him and Bartleby are sons of Adam, and he sees this sort of human bond that he has with him, and he tries to do the right thing, but the problem is he's a man who's so stuck in his logical, rational, conventional ways that he fails to really interact with Bartleby and why Bartleby is the way that he is. He doesn't dig deep enough into that. And the idea is that really his motivation for a lot of his actions throughout the story are rather selfish. He's trying to have a clear conscience, to feel that he's done as much as he could do, when in reality he hasn't done all that much for Bartleby. By letting him squat in the office and by refusing to call the police, he's constantly kind of self-congratulating himself for what he's done. And I thought a really good quote from this source, it says, "Mature Christians are those who have recognized their own complicity in the world's evil and have learned that they may not always enjoy the luxury of a clear conscience." And rather than really grapple with his role in the whole thing, the lawyer chooses to just take these conventional small actions to try and deal with the Bartleby enigma. And while, like I said, in the conventional sense, they're very kind, right? He tries to give him money, he tries to help him find a job, he even says he can come live with them. But the thing is, he's not recognizing Bartleby as an individual, as a person. He's not seeing that this is a man who's really broken down, in a certain sense, and that none of these things are reaching him at all. The idea is that rather than, constantly striving to feel that he's, done the right thing, maybe he needs to recognize the tragedy of the larger system, right? Of the absurdity that, these scriveners, their job is just to copy these documents. Like, that's their role in life. That's really the highest value that they are sort of believed to have, because unfortunately the economic system and Wall Street and the whole values that it encourages, it looks at people more or less as commodities and as what they can produce for the marketplace. And Bartleby is not valued very highly as an individual by this system. And as a result of that, you see him just break down but essentially he rejects it. I believe that it's an active rejection of Wall Street's values, and that's the part that, the Socrates and even this analysis to a certain extent, they support the idea that Bartleby is, maybe someone who transcended the system that he was placed within, someone who actually rather than was broken down by it, just simply chose actively to reject it and to reject, that role in it. And ultimately, the story is just so mysterious, right? People don't necessarily always understand. I didn't understand that when I first read it. So I think that what's really important in Melville's Bartleby is to understand that Bartleby's death was, it was not necessarily a tragedy so much as a lesson to be learned. Certainly, I believe even at the end of the story for the lawyer and for the reader as well. And that's really the point that I was trying to get across in my paper. So I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and thank you very much.